Someone has said that Ruth is the most preachable book of the Old Testament. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but it certainly is preachable in my opinion. And so I think it'll lend itself to a very interesting and encouraging study as we go along. I've entitled the series From Barrenness to Blessing. And that really speaks to the fact that Naomi goes from emptiness and futility to fullness. And it's really a statement for God's providential work and blessing in the lives of ordinary Israelites. What I like about Ruth is there's no angelic encounter in the book. There's no manna falling from the sky. It's simply ordinary Israelites in their day-to-day lives seeing God provide in remarkable and spectacular ways. And so it's an encouragement for us who also live in a day, I think, in which we see the providential hand of God, not necessarily a miracle around every corner, but in the everyday occurrences, in the so-called chance happenings, God is there. And so that will be encouraged and revealed to us, I think, as we work through the book of Ruth. What do we do with the book of Ruth? Well, what I have given you this morning is a bit of a handout that may seem like you've just jumped into a seminary class, and maybe that's a little bit of the case, but this is what we would do if we were to look at a book of the Bible by way of introduction. That is to say, setting up the story, setting up the setting for what takes place. We're probably all familiar with the narrative of Ruth. It's one of the more familiar stories of the Old Testament, so we're probably very conversant in what goes on, but I think there's a lot happening behind the scenes that when we draw together these connections, it will, in a fuller and richer way, really bring to the fore how God is blessing and working in the lives of these Israelites. All right, so we're just going to work through these categories that I have, and I'll pause and make some comments on some different points that I want to bring out, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. All right, I note there at the beginning that Ruth is the only book in the Bible that's named after a non-Israelite. What's remarkable about the book of Ruth, as we'll see, is not necessarily just that she marries Boaz and it leads eventually to David coming along, but it's that Ruth is a Moabitess. And there are all sorts of cultural, theological baggage that comes with the fact that she's a Moabitess. And we'll talk a little bit about this as we go through. But one of the black marks, if you will, in the history of Israel, of course, was what is called the Baal Peor incident, which is outlined in Numbers 25. And that's where Balaam, because he's not successful in getting to be able to curse the people of Israel, he comes up with Plan B. If you remember that, the Plan B is to seduce the Israelites with the Moabitess women. And so Ruth is a Moabitess, so immediately for the people of Israel, there's caution, red flags, some suspicion as to what's going on. And this really goes all the way back to when the Moabites came to be as a people. You remember that story back in Genesis? As a result of Lot fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah, you remember what happens? They go up to the caves and the hills, and his daughters say, "We're going to die. There's not a man left on the earth. What are we going to do?" And they concoct this plan where they inebriate their father. The first daughter goes in, then the second, and this is how the Moabites came to be. So right from the very beginning, through incest and immorality, their origins are very suspect. And that comes to fruition later in the Pentateuch, in the book of Numbers, where they're seduced by the Moabites. All right, so the fact that Ruth, as a Moabitess non-Israelite, would now be the central character, or at least the character after whom the book is named, is rather remarkable. In fact, it's one of only 2 books in the Bible named after a female character. If you want to know a good trivia question to use, the other, of course, is Esther. Okay, Ruth and Esther. Well, is the story really about Ruth? This is one of the first questions that often comes to mind as people study the book of Ruth. And the assumption is Ruth is the central character. I want to suggest, however, that in point of fact, it's probably more likely we should think of Naomi as the key character of Ruth. That is, Naomi is the central character. Ruth, for her part, has the fewest speeches, and her speeches are the shortest. When you're reading biblical narrative, particularly in the Old Testament, whoever speaks the most and has the longest speaking part is usually where the spotlight is shining. right? So one of the key litmus tests to know who's the central character is who speaks the most. So for instance, in the book of Joshua, Rahab gets the longest speech of any character in the book. And it's very significant there at the opening part of Joshua. Well, here Ruth doesn't have the most speaking parts, and really the narrative centers around Naomi. I quote here from Gregory Goswell, and he basically says that the plot centers around filling Naomi's emptiness. In fact, let's look at verse 21, thank you, of chapter 1. Naomi says this, "I went away full, the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So in that verse, Naomi is playing off her name. You recall that the name Naomi means pleasantness or sweetness, and she says, "No, I want you to call me Mara, because I'm embittered in soul, because the Lord has brought me back empty." So really, the narrative of Ruth, as we'll see as we study it, is about Naomi going from the place of exile, futility, and barrenness, and being brought back into the land to a place of blessing and fullness and redemption. And that's why chapter 1 really focuses around Naomi, and chapter 4 does as well. In fact, Ruth really isn't even a key figure in chapter 4. It centers instead around Naomi and the fact that Naomi has been blessed now because the Lord has revived the line. All right, so the book really is about Naomi, as we'll see, but Ruth is the character after whom the book is named. And she does have a central role. All right, as to dialogue, Boaz is prominent. He has the most speaking parts, as we'll see. All right, well, when does the book originate? When did it get written? The answer, as with most books of the Bible, is we simply don't know for sure. But there's always a Jewish tradition. I'll talk a little bit about this. The Jewish tradition is that Samuel wrote the book. Now, why would Samuel be a leading candidate to have written the book? What do you think? Why would Jewish tradition maybe think that Samuel could have written it? Would Samuel have a vested interest? Somebody say something.
He would have. A prophet, and he was a judge.
Okay, right. He was a prophet. He was a judge. I've said this before, but the prophets were viewed in the Old Testament as the curators of Israel's history. In fact, the books Joshua to Kings in Jewish tradition are called the former prophets, meaning that it's the prophetic account of the history of Israel. So he would have been interested from that standpoint. Dwayne, you had a thought too?
Would have had direct communication with the family, the descendants of, but with the family line.
Right, with the family of Jesse and David. Right. The last word in the Hebrew text of Ruth is the name David. And that's really what the book ultimately is about. So it's a bit of foreshadowing as we eventually get there. So Samuel, yes, he would have been intimately involved with David, and that's why he certainly is a possibility. Others, however, say there are some difficulties with this. One is perhaps David is a well-known figure at the time it's written, and Samuel died before David actually fully acceded to the throne. So perhaps that would be a difficulty. This is why others suggest, and I like this suggestion, it's probably where I would go, but I don't know for sure because we simply don't know, and that is that Nathan, the prophet, who is also familiar with David, he's the one who confronts him after the Bathsheba incident. Others have suggested Nathan the prophet. Nathan is the one who does give us a great parable about the man who had a little lamb, and a rich man came and took the lamb, and this incited David's wrath. You remember after this Bathsheba incident, and then Nathan turns the tables on him. Whoever did write the book of Ruth is a master at crafting the short story form, the literary form of a, some would say novella, but the idea of a short story account. So it's someone who has literary ability for sure. All right, I'll just mention this, but critical scholars say that the book is late because there are certain parts of the language which they take to be post-exilic. When we say post-exilic, we mean after the Babylonian captivity, when they come back into the land, which is around 520 BC. And so some would say that the language reflects that later date. The problem is you can amass just as much criteria that proves an early date as a late date, so it's inconclusive. It's kind of a wash. So in the end, it's possible that there are other factors that would lead people to think the language of the book is late. And this is a complicated discussion. I'm not going to get into it all this morning, but there were dialectical differences between northern Israel and southern Israel, and there are certain things in the book that seem, to me at least, to suggest a northern Israeli provenance. That's what a good seminary professor would say, meaning somebody in the north of Israel wrote the book, perhaps. So that's maybe what's going on. All right, let's look at the contents of the book. Most who structure or outline the book do so by way of acts and scenes, because it does more or less lend itself to a dramatic portrayal of this account of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. So if we look at it that way, we could structure the book in the following way. That is, there's an introduction, the covenant crisis for the royal line. As we'll see, the first 6 verses are really about the fact that Naomi is exiled. An interesting feature of the book, and we'll talk about this when we begin fully next week, is whenever Israel is mentioned, there's a Hebrew word that means land that is used to describe Israel. Israel is always land. Moab, where they go, is always fields, the fields of Moab. And so sometimes that's obscured in English translations because they try to smooth these things out, but it's a very important theological point. The theological point is this, that God's promises center on the promised land, the Eretz in Hebrew, which is Israel. Whereas when they're in Moab, they're in exile. They're out in the fields, the outlying area where they're beyond the pale of God's blessing. This goes all the way back to the Jacob and Esau story. Remember, Jacob was a whole man, a complete man. He dwelt in tents. He was in the land. Esau was what? He was a man of the fields, a wild man who was outside of God's sphere or realm of blessing. Okay, so they go there and they experience the futility curses. We could go back and look at Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, and see that if you disobey the covenant, what's going to happen? Barrenness, futility, all these threats come to fruition in their life, and they're in Moab, and all this happens. So the Lord brings them back. So it's kind of like we have a mini Exodus. They return. And as we'll see on the next page, the word return is the key word of chapter 1. It's used, I want to say, about a dozen or so times in chapter 1. The idea is a new Exodus coming back. All right, and then we have several other acts. Boaz the Redeemer. There's hope now for the royal line. This is when Ruth happens by chance, as the narrator ironically says, to go into the field of Boaz. And of course, the chance encounter is what? It's God's providential design and orchestration of events for his blessing. Then we have the plan of redemption. We'll talk a little about this in chapter 3. There's a lot of debate about how we're to view this incident at the threshing floor, right? If we think about Ruth's background as a Moabitess and all that cultural baggage, remember that I talked about at the beginning, there's some indications that maybe the Israelite audience would be uncomfortable with what's going on. Ruth is washing and bathing herself and getting all dressed up, and you kind of begin to wonder, what's going on? But it seems that the point of the story is to show that she's a woman of integrity. Boaz is a man of integrity, and God uses this plan, whether or not it's positive or negative, we'll talk about that when we eventually get there, to bring about his redemptive purposes. So a very fascinating way that God works through those incidents. Then we have in Act 4, the consummation of redemption. That's where Boaz takes Ruth and marries her. Some would call this levirate marriage. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. You remember in the Old Testament, if a brother was married and there was no posterity and the brother died, what happens? The next brother takes the wife in order to propagate the line, to keep a memorial for that lineage. And so there's perhaps facets of that going on here when Ruth and Boaz wed. And then we have this last part, the genealogical confirmation. Now, some almost skip these last several verses, but I think this is what the whole book has been building toward, this genealogy at the end. And I love genealogies because, I always love the obscure and neglected parts of Scripture that other people may not have as much patience for, but the genealogies are a goldmine of very interesting information. And particularly here, we see a pattern that replicates what happens in Genesis 5 and other places where you have a linear genealogy. There are two types of genealogy in the Bible, linear and segmented. You ever heard this before or familiar with this? A linear genealogy is A, B, C, D, and goes down through the line. Whenever you see a linear genealogy, it's usually almost a royal overtone to it, and it's the chosen seed that's being developed. Then you have what's called a segmented genealogy. Okay, a segmented genealogy is when A has sons A prime, B prime, C prime, D prime. And so you immediately have a dispersion and diffusion of the line. So keep this in mind as you're reading genealogies in the Old Testament, because even though they may seem somewhat boring and obscure, picking out linear versus segmented tells you a lot about what the author is trying to accomplish. In a linear genealogy, he's saying that this line is a chosen line with royal overtones that's going to bring the blessing that God promised Abraham. So in this case, it's a linear genealogy, and we'll talk about that. It's really interesting. It starts with Perez instead of Judah. And there are some other interesting things. They always have 10 names and focus on the 7th and 10th name. So we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, so I want to just point out some things that I found interesting as I was amassing some materials on studying Ruth. One is the royal symbolism in Tamar and Ruth. And this, I think, is a fascinating thing. So I want to just spend a moment here looking at this. You may or may not be thoughtful or mindful of this, but when we think about Old Testament female characters, we know certain ones are prominent because in the Gospels they're developed as having given rise to the line of Jesus Christ, right? So we know there are 5 women outlined, for instance, in Matthew. And so 2 of these individuals are Tamar and Ruth. Well, when you dig down a little deeper and try to understand what's going on, there are some fascinating parallels between the 2 accounts. So let me just outline this. Both give rise to a prominent descendant, David and then Christ. Both come from a foreign origin. Tamar is a Canaanite woman who comes into the line. Ruth is a Moabitess who comes into the line. Both use some sort of intrigue to obtain rights to this royal line. You remember the story of Tamar in Genesis 38. She dresses as a prostitute and meets Judah because Judah has failed to give her his next son, Shelah, because he's just neglected, and there's probably some wonder about what is she doing because of the 2 other sons who had died. So he fails to do this, and so Tamar dresses up and meets Judah, and then as a result of that, she conceives and has twins. And I want to just point this out. Let's look back at Genesis 38, if you could turn back there. It's a very interesting story because you start in chapter 37 with Joseph, and you think, okay, now we're going to talk about Joseph, and then all of a sudden you go back to Judah and Tamar. It seems kind of interesting why the narrator does that until you see what happens. It's a foil. Judah's bad behavior is a foil for Joseph's pure behavior, right? Joseph Potiphar's wife attempts to seduce Joseph, and Joseph does not give in to her blandishments. Rather, he keeps his integrity, whereas Judah consorts with prostitutes in chapter 38. All right, well, looking here at verse 18, she asks for a pledge. All right, let's actually go up and look at verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." Okay, what does this mean? Well, in the original audience, this is just a customary payment for a prostitute. So that's what the transaction seems to suggest here. And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Now, probably most of the times that we've read this story, we just kind of skip over this as like, okay, she just randomly probably grabbed whatever he had with him at the time. But I want to suggest that the narrator's very careful in including these details because all of these things have royal overtones to them, right? A signet ring, a cord, and a staff. And this really comes to fruition when Jacob blesses Judah. If you turn forward to Genesis 49 and verse 10. Remember, he makes this famous prophecy about Judah. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. I think that the narrator here is consciously suggesting that through Judah, the royal line will come. And this is why Tamar asks specifically for these certain things. This is why the details are included in the narrative. All right, so very interesting. Gives us an idea of royal prerogative. And in Ruth, also there's redemption of land and levirate marriage to preserve life and lineage. The question about Ruth that's always asked is, why is land included with the marriage contract? In other words, it's hard to find, in fact impossible really to find, a clear place in the law where a brother is required or a relative is required not only to marry but also to inherit land in quite the way that Ruth outlines it. So the question is, what's going on in Ruth? Perhaps there's an ancient custom that's involved. But whatever is going on, there's both land rights as well as marriage rights that are included in this wedding between Boaz and Ruth. And whenever there's land and seed, these themes tie into the royal idea of God's blessing. When God blesses Abraham, he promises him land, seed, and blessing. And these come to fruition in Messiah, who's the king, who has all of these properties. All right, so all that to say, Ruth seems to consciously echo some of the themes of the Judah-Tamar incident to suggest Ruth is also an outside woman who's brought in and God providentially allows to be part of the chosen line leading to David. All right, if you read the Old Testament and really get into the narratives, which I love to do, you find that for them, acting out their faith, that is, to live obediently and righteously, was to acknowledge the supremacy of the Davidic king. Think about how many stories in Kings are about how the line almost goes extinct, right? There's one boy left who the nurse hides and nobody finds. Well, what is she doing? She's working out her salvation with fear and trembling. She's keeping the line alive because that's the promise. The promise is coming through this line. So for an Israelite, when we read this book, we have to think as an Israelite, think as the original audience. What would this mean to them? This means God's blessing is coming to fruition through this obscure Moabitess woman who marries into the line. All right, enough said about that. Okay, so canonical and traditional significance of the book. Let's talk a little bit about this. There have been a lot of studies lately, this is kind of a hot topic these days, about where do we put the book in our Bible? Where is the book placed? And does that have any help for us as we read the book? Now, probably to most of us when we read, we would suggest that the way books are arranged or ordered in our Bible is more or less random. Probably you've not really given it much thought. Why does this book follow this book or this book? And if book A is followed by book B, does that change how we read book A or book B? I want to suggest that perhaps it does help us a little bit to situate ourselves so when we read a book, we read it like the original audience would have read it. And so even in the New Testament, there is conscious arrangement, right? You have Gospels, followed by history, followed by epistles, followed by apocalyptic prophetic literature. And I could tell you a lot more even about that, how they're arranged. You have 7 churches that get epistles, 3 individuals. They go from largest to shortest. And there's a lot of conscious symmetry and arrangement there. Well, in the Old Testament, I think it's the same way. And so I want to talk about 2 ways that the book of Ruth is arranged and to help us as a reading strategy to really understand what's going on. In our Bibles, all of us learned when we used to do sword drills in Sunday school. I don't know if they do this much anymore, but when I was a kid, that was much the case. And so you had to learn the books of the Bible. In fact, if you learned the books of the Bible in a church we went out to in California and in the young children Sunday school classes, you were given a gift Bible. You won a Bible if you could say the books in order, and that's a helpful thing so that we know where to find things. I used to have a Bible teacher who said, a verse is a great friend, but it's of no use to you if you don't know the address, right? Knowing where it's found. All right, so Ruth in our Bible follows the book of Judges, and it probably seems fairly straightforward why it does, right? If we look at the first part of Ruth chapter 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Okay, so right away we get this historical setting. It's taking place in the days of the judges. Now what's interesting about this is in this arrangement, this follows right on the heels of the stories of Judges. And in fact, in some Hebrew Bibles, Ruth was included as part of Judges. But what I find really fascinating is it's not only following the stories of the Judges, but it's the third successive story centered upon Bethlehem. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but when I try to read through the Bible every year, and this year reading through Judges, and the thought struck me how often Bethlehem and the Levites are centered upon in the latter part of Judges. In fact, you have these what seem like random stories, right? 17 to 21, you have a series of what seem to be random stories. Well, I think there's a conscious effort at the end of Judges here to highlight certain features that are going to be prominent in the royal line to come. So let me talk about this for a moment. In Judges 17 to 18, you have this story about the idols and the counterfeit cult. What's interesting about this is if you look at verse 7 of chapter 17, I'm in Judges now, Judges 17:7, there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite. Okay, so you have this Levite who's from all places in Israel he could possibly be, right? Read through the end of Joshua and you know there are a lot of cities in Israel that never really get mentioned, but that were there. He's from Bethlehem, of all places. And so the story focuses and goes forward from there. If we fast forward to the second ending of the book, the second epilogue, chapter 19, again, the characters here originate from Bethlehem. Look at chapter 19, verse 1. In those days there was no king in Israel. A certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. So in that sense, what is really interesting is Ruth would be the third consecutive series of accounts or episode that centers around Bethlehem. And how drastically different, though, is what happens in Bethlehem in Ruth's day, right? Because Boaz is a redeeming figure who brings God's grace. So Ruth, in that sense, would be a welcome contrast to the decadence of the Judges' stories. Now, in the Hebrew Bibles, in a couple other Hebrew versions, Ruth follows Proverbs. You probably are familiar with this connection. Let me just mention it. Proverbs ends, of course, chapter 31, right, with the woman of noble character, the wife of noble character, as the NIV says. And that's what's outlined in chapters 31. The only other time in the whole Old Testament that phrase, a woman of noble character, is used is in the book of Ruth. In Ruth 3:11, Boaz says that Ruth is a woman of noble character. So that's an interesting connection, that Ruth kind of fleshes out the Proverbs 31 woman of noble character. But the other thing to think about that's also interesting from that is Proverbs also admonishes against seduction by an outside woman. In Proverbs 2:16, you remember it says, Solomon there cautions about the outside woman. Ruth uses that same term to describe herself. In Ruth 2, she says, "You've shown me grace even though I am a foreigner. I am an outside woman." And I already had alluded to the fact that in Numbers 25, the Israelites are seduced by the women of Moab. So Ruth becomes the outside woman who by God's grace is transformed into a wife of noble character because of her allegiance to the Lord. And that begins in Ruth 1. Remember, she not only says to Naomi, "I'm going to go with you," she says, "Your God will be my God." So it's a spiritual decision, a theological decision as well. All right, let me just mention this one other thing about Jewish tradition. In Jewish tradition, Ruth is read during the festival of weeks or Pentecost. Okay, I don't know how familiar you may feel or how well the understanding of the Jewish festivals is. I have to say it's very difficult for us to understand what's going on because often these festivals seem very foreign to us. But the festival of weeks or Pentecost, we know from the book of Acts, is when the church begins. In Jewish tradition, it's when the law was given. Traditionally, that's what they say happened on Pentecost. God gave the law. And in giving the law, he constituted the nation of Israel. In the New Testament, he constitutes the church. And he gives the Holy Spirit to the church in Acts 2. What's interesting about this is this feast is associated with harvest and with the law. And we could read through a lot of these passages. I want to just focus in on one. Let's look at Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23, where Moses outlines several of the festivals that will take place. And remember, Pentecost happens 50 days after Passover. So beginning in verse 15 of Leviticus 23, you shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Okay, so here it outlines how after the first fruits of the wheat harvest in the previous verses and after Passover, 50 days later they celebrate Pentecost. And it's a harvest festival. Now what's interesting about this festival is there are a few unique customs. One is that you present leavened bread. Okay, if you look at verse 17, you shall bring from your dwelling place 2 loaves of bread to be waved, made of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour, and they shall be baked with leaven, as firstfruits to the Lord. And you shall present with the bread 7 lambs, and so on and so forth. Now verse 20, and the priest shall wave them with the bread of the firstfruits, which is talking about the firstfruits festival, as a wave offering before the Lord with the 2 lambs. What's unique about this is it's the only festival outlining a presentation of leavened bread. Now, leaven, we know, right, in the Bible is often a symbol of evil. What does Jesus say? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. What's interesting about this, and my own thought on this, is that what is going on here is this is a hint at the inclusion of Gentiles with the promised people. Because there are 2 loaves of bread, they are to be waved with the firstfruits bread. Okay, now if you think about this, there's all sorts of possible connections we can make to Christ and to the church, right? That Christ rises from the dead. He's the firstfruits. This language is used by Paul and the apostle throughout the New Testament. They're the firstfruits. And in the festival of Pentecost, they are waved with the bread of firstfruits, signifying, I think, a union. And not only that, but there's a fellowship offering of 2 lambs, which again is unique to this idea. So this wave, and it's not even sure how they waved. Some almost think that they made something like the sign of the cross or perhaps heaved it in some way. But it's fascinating how possibly this all connects to the fact that there would be an inclusion of Gentiles into the promised blessing, which in fact does happen in Acts, right? The church grows, the Gentiles come in. And from an Israelite perspective, it happens in the book of Ruth, because the Moabitess, who should be an outsider that we avoid at all costs if we're following the wisdom of Proverbs, she actually now is blessed and brought into the line. So anyway, some interesting things. Those sorts of things really fascinate me, and hopefully they're of moderate interest to you as well. All right, let me just talk about literary forms of the book. A couple things that are interesting. This is a dialogue-heavy historical short story. 53% of the book is speech, direct speech, so you could almost act this out as a play. It's very speech-heavy. There's a lot of symmetry. Chapters 1 and 4 mirror each other. In both chapters there are ties of kinship, followed by the women of Bethlehem speaking to Naomi. In chapters 2 and 3, you have symmetry. In both, Naomi bids Ruth to go either to the fields or to the threshing floor, where Ruth encounters Boaz and is blessed in some way. So there's a lot of symmetry and artistry that the author is bringing in crafting this narrative. All right, and then there are some key words, and I outlined those for you. I could even, almost just teach a lesson on this. The idea that this is the steps of redemption here. One other thing, I just want to bring this out because I forgot. In Leviticus 23, the other thing that's really interesting about the Festival of Weeks, and I don't know if I brought this out, but it ends by saying, don't reap your harvest all the way to the edge of your field so that the poor and sojourners can glean. Right? At the end of, in verse 22 of Leviticus 23. And what's interesting is, of course, that's exactly what's happening in Ruth, right? Ruth, the sojourner, comes in, and Boaz is an obedient Torah keeper. He does this so that Ruth can prosper and benefit from it. So there's all sorts of connections that are really interesting there. All right, well, if you just looked at the key words of the book, chapter 1 is return. Naomi's in exile. She has to come back. She comes back. And then the idea of glean. God is providing through the leftovers, if you will, of his people. right? What did the Syrophoenician women say to Jesus? Even the dogs eat the crumbs under the table. And so Ruth comes and she's gleaning and she's blessed in some way. Chapter 3, the threshing floor. There has to be a place where redemption is acted out. And that's what the threshing floor functions as. And then chapter 4, we have redeem or redeemer being the key word there. The idea of Boaz acting. And what's very interesting is the narrator of Ruth never reveals the name of the other relative, right? He literally in Hebrew says something like Mr. So-and-so. Boaz is named, and Boaz is central, but the other guy never gets named. It's almost as the narrator is saying, he lost out on an opportunity to memorialize his name, so I'm not going to even include his name. Just like what Moses does with naming the two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who deliver the babies, but we never even know who the Pharaoh is. Pharaoh is a title. It's not a personal name. And so the great king of the universe, he thought, doesn't even get mentioned. All right, here then finally is the theology of the book. And a couple key interesting facts here. I'll just move quickly because our time is up. The first is God's guidance and providence. A key term is the Hebrew term hesed, loyal love. Almost impossible to have an exhaustive equivalent in English. The idea is loving kindness. And this occurs at critical places in the book, and it shows God's faithfulness. There's a lot of irony in the book. The narrator says that Ruth, by chance, comes on the field of Boaz. And you can kind of imagine him smiling as he writes that, because we know nothing happens by chance. God's in control. And so he uses that to bring about his purposes. I want to focus on my sentence here at the last part. There are no miracles or supernatural visits. There's no angel encounter. It's just ordinary people. But the human characters are agents in bringing to pass divine providence. And this is remarkably and beautifully drawn out. Let me give you a couple examples. In the first part of the book, Naomi asks God to provide rest. Manoach is the Hebrew word, a home or resting place for Ruth. Later on in chapter 3, Naomi herself says, I'm going to find you rest, a home, a manoach. Later on, Boaz asks God to recompense Ruth because Ruth has taken shelter under God's wings in chapter 2. That same word kanaf is used in chapter 3 when Boaz spreads the wing of his garment over Ruth. So reading this in the Hebrew just is like a high-def color television because it brings out all these nuances that Boaz is acting out what God has done. He's providing the wing of protection. And then God's kindness toward the family in chapter 2 hints at Ruth's kindness toward the family. The same word again is used. So what's the point? The point is God uses regular people like us to bring about his purposes, right? His redemptive purposes. You may think, I have the most boring job in the world and nothing exciting ever happens in my life. And we may live our whole lives and think, did I really accomplish anything? Well, God is using regular people. That's a comfort, I think, right? Regular people like us, he uses for his purposes. All right, a couple other points. God's redemptive plan unfolds through his people. There's a lot of interesting thing here, and we'll talk about this in chapter 1. Naomi calls God Shaddai, but she means it as a slight, because Shaddai is associated with the patriarchs with fertility and land promises, and she's saying, look, I have nothing. I come back empty-handed. But later on, Shaddai does, in fact, give her land and life through Ruth. There's the inclusion of non-Israelites in the covenant. Okay, Ruth is brought in. What I find a very fascinating thing is Deuteronomy 23:3 says, no descendant of an Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord until the 10th generation. Well, that excludes David, right? Because David is the descendant of a Moabite. So what's going on there? I think what this means is Ruth is viewed as having become an Israelite woman. She's been brought into the covenant, and the wings of God and Boaz have sheltered her, and she's now part of the family. And then, lastly, royal progeny and inheritance. The genealogy likely starts with Perez because he's the generation that goes down to Egypt, symbolizing exile and captivity in a foreign land. This is what happens to Naomi. She is exiled in a foreign land, the fields of Moab. But the genealogy also gives us hope because it points to David. It has 10 generations focusing on the 7th, Boaz, and the 10th, David. And so in that sense, it ends with this hopeful note, David has come. Well, we know, ultimately, the note that we'll be singing through all eternity is Jesus has come. And this line leads inexorably to Jesus Christ. And that's why as Christians, we read Ruth and rejoice at how God used obscure, forgotten people in the backwater of the Judean hillside to bring about his redemptive purposes. If Ruth hadn't happened, we couldn't be saved. Jesus had to come through the line of Judah. And so God providentially brings it to pass. All right, well, that's an overview of the book of Ruth, and I know I've done most of the talking today, and I apologize. I'll try to make up for that in the next few weeks and include more discussion and such as we go forward. But I'm excited about it, and I think it'll prove to be a helpful and encouraging study.